Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture. Chapter 2 in Takaki's book discusses the early encounters between the English settlers and the indigenous people of the United States, and how the English created a distinction between civilization and savagery, between themselves and populations they defined as other. The reading discussed how the idea of the savage was developed by the English in their relationship with the Irish. How the Irish were treated became a model for how English settlers would treat indigenous people in the US. And here you see how the English perceived the Irish as lazy, unwilling to work, and criminals. The Irish were not allowed to carry weapons, own land, or serve as a juror or witness. And their violence towards the Irish included burning their villages and crops and relocating them to reservations. And a lot of this will, sound familiar as we discuss how the English settlers treated the indigenous population when they arrived to the US. The indigenous peoples that the English first encountered were farmers, and thus were able to provide food when the English settlers began to run out of provisions and beginning to starve. However, as more settlers arrived, they began to desire indigenous land, first for their farms and then for tobacco. The reading talked about how the cultivation of tobacco as an export crop increased English demand for land, and English encroachment onto native land resulted in violence between indigenous tribes and English settlers. In New England, the Puritans found indigenous communities to also be farmers. They also found that a large number of them had already been dying as a result of European diseases. The Puritans interpreted these deaths as divinely sanctioned opportunities to take the land of Native Americans. So they interpreted the death of indigenous people in religious terms. The Puritans justified taking indigenous land by arguing that indigenous people lacked a work ethic. As we saw in the reading, indigenous people weren't just victims of the English settlers. There were numerous attempts at resistance against the English settlers. Indigenous people did resist English violence and encroachment on their land. Several wars broke out between indigenous tribes and English settlers. Of particular note is King Philip's War, where the leader of the Wampanoag, known as King Philip, created an alliance between several indigenous tribes to collectively attack English settlements. And this war happened between 1675 and 1676. The indigenous people came to be demonized by the English settlers and thus represented to the English the evil or sinfulness they should avoid at all costs. As the reading stated, vigilance against sin was required, or else the English would become like the Indians. Thomas Jefferson epitomizes the contradictory ways in which indigenous people were perceived and treated. On the one hand, he stated that whites and Indians were both Americans and born in the same land, yet he believed that all Indians needed to be either civilized or exterminated. By civilized, he meant they needed to take on English culture and way of life. Indigenous poverty, disease, and death was explained as their own fault, a result of them maintaining their own culture and way of life, instead of on the introduction of European diseases, appropriation of their lands, and warfare. And so we see here the beginning of the model of blaming the victim and rewriting history. In chapter 3, Takaki begins to explain the origins of the use of slave labor in the United States. As we saw in the reading, at first the workforce in the British colonies were made up of poor European indentured servants who were contracted to work for a number of years. The Africans that existed in the US at that time also worked as indentured servants, not as slaves. This meant that there were close interactions between whites and blacks, including sexual relations for which both were punished, as we saw a number of examples discussed in the reading. Although they were both indentured servants, we see evidence that distinctions were starting to be made between Black and white indentured servants. For instance, when runaways were captured, the Black indentured servant was punished more severely than the white indentured servant. We also see a class distinction and competition arising between indentured servants who had rights to land once the indentured period ended, and white elite landowners who wanted the best lands for themselves. Lawmakers began to create laws that kept indentured servants in service for longer as a way to keep their white labor supply for longer and decrease competition for land ownership. These divisions eventually culminate in Bacon's Rebellion. In Baker's Rebellion, white indentured servants joined forces with enslaved Africans and freedmen to protest their conditions. This massive rebellion, in which protesters demanded an end to their servitude, burned Jamestown to the ground. And it was a clear threat to the status quo. In the aftermath, whites were granted additional rights and privileges in an effort to ensure that they did not act in solidarity with Africans. So Bacon's Rebellion really kind of opened the eyes of the white elite to the potential dangers of poor whites and poor Blacks, slaves and indentured servants, creating coalitions and coming together, and how they could together be a particular force that would threaten the white elites. And so they had to come up with ways to break apart that potential solidarity between white and Black servants and slaves. And they did this by providing more rights to those white indentured servants as they became freed from their contracts. The white planters decided to reorganize society based on race and class, where poor whites were given additional privileges while they expanded their reliance on Black slave labor, a labor force that as slaves, white elites could better control. And so this results in an increase in a reliance on Black labor and defining Black labor as slaves. Slave codes were created as a series of laws that removed all rights of slaves and created distinctions between whites and Blacks. Whites were people who had rights, and Blacks were slaves with no rights. In this case, once again, we see Jeffersonian contradictions, where he was in favor of emancipation and had a lot of internal moral conflict around slavery and owning slaves, yet nonetheless, he owned quite a number of slaves. He believed if emancipated, Blacks needed to be deported. So even though he was in favor of emancipation, and there were a lot of whites who were in favor of emancipating the slaves, this does not necessarily mean that they saw Black people as their equals. They continued to have ideas of Black people as inferior. And so a lot of the question was, well, if we emancipate the slaves, what do we do with them? Because we can't possibly have Black people living with white people. And Jefferson was one of those who believed that if emancipated, Blacks needed to be deported. We saw a large population of Blacks in Virginia, or he saw, since he was a Virginian, a large population of Blacks as a threat to whites, and believed that Blacks were inherently inferior to whites. Yet nonetheless, as we saw in the reading, he had a long-standing relationship with his slave, Sally Hemings, and had quite a number of children with her. So this ends our lecture for today, for this week. You guys have a good week, and I'll see you next time.